She rode motorcycles. She drank hard. She moved through the world like someone who had long ago made peace with being misunderstood. And for years, the world was more than happy to misunderstand her. When the movie came out, audiences watched a version of her life on a screen and felt things: grief, discomfort, maybe even a quiet, reluctant admiration. Cher played her. The film won awards. People cried in dark theaters and then they walked outside into the cool night air and moved on with their lives. But Rusty Dennis never got to move on. She lived inside that story. She lived inside the grief that the film had only borrowed for 2 hours and then handed back. And near the end of her life, after years of silence and distance and the kind of pain that doesn't show up well in photographs, she finally spoke. What she said was not what most people were expecting. It wasn't a clean apology. It wasn't a tidy redemption arc wrapped up in quotable lines. It was something far heavier than that. Something that made people stop, sit back, and reconsider everything they thought they understood about her son Rocky, and about the strange, brutal, deeply tender relationship they had shared in the years before he died. She was a mother. She was flawed in ways that most people are not willing to forgive. And she loved her son in the only way she knew how, which was not always the right way and not always enough, but it was real. Before she died, Rusty Dennis told the truth. And the truth, as it turned out, was far more complicated, far more human than any movie could ever hold. Rocky Dennis came into the world in 1961, carrying something the world had almost no language for. The condition was called cranioediaphyseal dysplasia. The name is cold and clinical, the kind of term that lives in medical textbooks and specialist reports. But what it meant in real life, in daily life, was that calcium was building up abnormally inside his skull, causing his facial bones to grow in ways that were impossible to ignore. His face looked dramatically different from anything most people had ever seen. And from the time he was a very small child, the world let him know it. Strangers stared, some pulled back. Some said things out loud that no adult should ever say in front of a child. But Rocky Dennis was never going to let that be the whole story. The people who actually knew him, who sat beside him and laughed with him, described someone warm and magnetic in ways that had absolutely nothing to do with the way he looked. He was sharp. He had a dry, quick humor that caught people completely off guard. He made real friends. He went to school like any other kid. He wanted what most teenagers want: connection, respect, a little freedom, and the quiet, ordinary dignity of being seen as a full person rather than something to stare at. He got some of those things, not all of them, not without a fight. And at the very center of his life, standing in the space where a steady and conventional parent might have been, was his mother, Rusty. Rusty Dennis was not a conventional woman, and she never pretended to be. She had grown up hard. She had lived at the edges of what most people called normal, and those edges had become as much a part of her identity as anything else. She was embedded in a biker community. She drank heavily for many years, in the way that people drink when drinking is doing something for them that nothing else can. She existed inside a world that mainstream America viewed with suspicion at best and contempt at worst. And yet, by the accounts of people who actually knew her, she was fiercely, almost ferociously devoted to her son. That contradiction is what the movie tried to capture. It is also what real life made so much harder to hold. Because devotion, when it lives alongside addiction and chaos and instability, does not always look like devotion from the outside. Sometimes it looks like negligence. Sometimes it looks like failure. Sometimes it looks exactly like love, just love wearing the wrong clothes in the wrong place at the wrong time. Rocky died in 1978. He was 17 years old. His death was linked to a brain condition connected to his illness. He had lived longer than many doctors had predicted he would. He had lived more fully than many people believed was even possible for someone carrying what he carried. And then he was gone. And Rusty Dennis spent the rest of her life learning what it meant to carry that. Long before there was a film, before there was a famous actress and an awards ceremony and a poster on a cinema wall, Rusty Dennis was simply a mother trying to raise a child that the world had not made room for. Rocky's early years were hard, but they were not without warmth and they were not without joy. Rusty made choices that most parents would never have made. She brought Rocky into her world openly, without hesitation, without apology. She did not hide him away. She did not build a sheltered bubble around him or keep him at a careful distance from the roughness of real life. She took him to biker gatherings and parties, to places filled with people who were loud and complicated and not always kind in the polished way of a school parent or a neighbor. Some people looking back have argued that this exposed Rocky to things a child simply shouldn't have been exposed to, but others who were actually there have described it differently. They say it gave Rocky something rare, a community that accepted him on unusual terms, people who weren't performing politeness, who weren't smiling through their discomfort. People who either took Rocky as he was or they didn't, and when they did, it was genuine, no performance, no pity. Rocky learned young how to move through discomfort. He learned how to hold someone's gaze when that gaze was doing something unkind. He learned to carry himself with a quietness and a steadiness that, by the time he was a teenager, had become one of the most remarkable things about him. His teachers saw it. His friends felt it. He was not out there trying to convince the world to accept him. He had arrived, somehow through everything, at something close to an acceptance of himself. And in the world Rocky lived in that era, in those circumstances, that kind of interior peace is not something that just happens. It comes from somewhere. It gets built piece by someone. Some of it, a meaningful part of it, came from Rusty. Because for all of her chaos, she had never once looked at her son and communicated that he was less than complete. She had never flinched at his face. She had never used the diminished, clinical, sorrowful language that so many institutions and doctors and well-meaning strangers defaulted to when they spoke about Rocky or around him. She looked at him and she saw him, not a diagnosis, not a tragedy, not a lesson in resilience for other people, to borrow her son. That part of the story gets lost easily when people focus on her failures, and her failures were real and they mattered, but so was this. So was the fact that Rocky Dennis grew up knowing, somewhere deep and certain, that his mother saw him whole. When Peter Bogdanovich released Mask in 1985, it moved people in ways that genuine films about real lives sometimes do. Cher's performance as Rusty Dennis earned her the Best Actress award at Cannes. Eric Stoltz brought Rocky to life with a physical and emotional generosity that left audiences shaken. The film was celebrated widely. It was described as honest. It was called brave. Rusty Dennis hated parts of it, not because it showed her addiction and her chaos, it did, and she knew it would. Not entirely because it simplified her story. Simplification is what films do. What she objected to most fiercely, most publicly, was the removal of the motorcycle club at the center of her and Rocky's real life, a group called the Pistons. The studio had edited them out significantly, replacing the soundtrack they were connected to with something the producers considered more commercially appropriate. To Rusty, that was not a creative decision. It was a lie. That community had been real. Those people had been genuinely present in Rocky's life. They had offered him a form of acceptance that the film, in quietly removing them, had erased in favor of something cleaner and easier for a mainstream audience to sit with. Something that wouldn't make people too uncomfortable in the parts where they were supposed to feel good. She filed a lawsuit over it. It did not go the way she had hoped. But the fact that she fought it all says something important about who Rusty Dennis actually was. She was not upset simply about how she had been portrayed. She was upset on behalf of Rocky's truth. The complete and unedited truth of who he was and who had actually been there with him. She couldn't give Rocky more years. She couldn't undo the things she had done or not done. But she could fight for the honesty of his story, and she did. The film made Rocky Dennis famous in a particular way, famous as a symbol of resilience, of innocence, of everything that is cruel about a world that measures people by the surface of their face. All of that is real and worth carrying. But Rocky was also a specific, living, irreplaceable human being. And Rusty understood better than anyone the distance between the symbol the world had made of her son and the actual person she had raised. She never stopped feeling that distance. And she never stopped resenting it quietly on his behalf. After Rocky died, Rusty did not find her way to an easy place. She kept struggling with addiction for years after his death. The grief of losing a child, a 17-year-old child, does not find its shape quickly. It does not arrive at something manageable on any predictable schedule. And for Rusty, who had organized so much of her daily life and sense of self around being Rocky's mother, his absence didn't just break something. It removed something structural. Something the rest of her life had to figure out how to stand without. She did eventually get sober. That is not a small or easy thing to say about someone with her history, her environment, her relationship with substances that had run so deep and for so long. Sobriety for Rusty Dennis was not a quiet personal decision. It was a fight that required starting over more than once and holding on each time until it finally held. People around her during those years described someone working hard to become something different. Not someone trying to erase who she had been, but someone who was refusing, day by day, to be entirely ruled by it anymore. She began speaking publicly about Rocky, about her experience as his mother, about what it had meant to raise a child with a condition as severe and visible as his. She connected with medical communities and advocacy groups. She spent time with families who were just beginning to navigate the same impossible territory she had walked. She was trying to do something with the loss, trying to make Rocky's life mean something in the time after his life, but grief, as anyone who has carried it knows, does not move in a straight line. And Rusty Dennis was never a woman built for smooth, predictable emotional ground. There were setbacks, silences, stretches of years where the public record of her life goes thin and quiet, and accounts become difficult to trace. What stayed constant through all of it was how she talked about Rocky on the occasions when she did. She never spoke about him the way grieving parents sometimes learn to speak about a loss, with a careful, managed softness, a deliberate distance. She spoke about him the way you speak about someone who is still present, still real in the interior life. Someone whose voice you still hear in the rooms of your own thinking, even years after the body is gone. Near the end of her life, Rusty Dennis became unusually open. In a series of interviews and personal gatherings, she said things she had not said before, in ways she had not said them before. She talked about regret. Not the performed, careful kind of regret that people offer in public settings when they know they are being watched and assessed. The faltering kind. The kind that surfaces when someone has been turning specific moments over in their mind for 20 or 30 years and still hasn't found the right words for what those moments cost. She said she wished she had been more present. Not physically, she had been physically present in Rocky's life to a degree most parents aren't. What she meant was something harder to name. She acknowledged that her addiction, her pain, her own relentless need to survive herself had sometimes built a wall between them. A wall Rocky would have felt even if he never once said so. Even if he never gave her any sign that he noticed. She talked about specific nights when she had not been what she should have been. Occasions when her grief or her drinking or the sheer overwhelming weight of her own inner life had taken precedence over what Rocky needed from her in that moment. She didn't offer these admissions as a bid for forgiveness. She framed them more like a debt. An accounting she owed to his memory, even if giving that accounting honestly made her look worse than silence would have. That is what made those final interviews so striking to the people who were present for them. She also talked, with a care and slowness that felt new in her, about what Rocky had given her. How he had changed in ways she was still discovering, the fundamental shape of how she understood what love was. He had taught her something she had not been able to articulate while he was alive. That unconditional love was something she had received from him long before she had become capable of returning it. Fully. That he had loved her through her worst self, not because she had earned it, but because he had simply chosen to. Every day, quietly, without making a production of it. For a woman who had never moved comfortably through sentiment, that admission carried real weight. What Rusty said before she died was never designed to settle anything neatly. It opened things rather than closing them. She spoke about moments in Rocky's life that had never been discussed publicly. She talked about her own fear, not the bold, cinematic fear of a mother fighting for her child in a way that looks heroic from a distance, but the shapeless, daily, grinding fear of someone who knew from early on that her child's illness would eventually take him, and who had no map for how to carry that knowledge and still show up functional every day. She described what it was like to walk into a room with Rocky and read it before he could. To position herself unconsciously and then very consciously in ways that would intercept whatever was coming before it reached him. The invisible work of that, year after year, never acknowledged. Never named by anyone around her as a particular kind of labor, because it happened so quietly and so constantly that it had just become part of how she existed in the world. She also talked about guilt, but not the guilt people might have assumed she would carry, not just the obvious guilt of the drinking, the instability, the chaos. She had addressed versions of that before in other contexts. This was something more specific and harder to look at. She talked about moments where she had chosen her own emotional survival over what Rocky needed. She couldn't always say precisely what those choices had cost him, but she felt the weight of them. She had been feeling it for years. What was remarkable to those present was that she wasn't asking to be let off the hook. She was doing something more difficult and less rewarded than seeking absolution. She was trying to be honest, in a way she hadn't been capable of when Rocky was alive. Perhaps because that level of honesty would have required a kind of emotional presence she couldn't maintain back then. What she said was devastating precisely because it was so quiet, so specific, so lacking in drama. It was the voice of a woman who had outlived her son by decades and was still at the very end of her own life, trying to honestly understand what she had meant to him and what she had failed to be. There is a kind of grief that does not resolve. It doesn't pass through stages and arrive somewhere peaceful. It doesn't transform over time into acceptance or wisdom or any of the comfortable destinations that the language around grief tends to promise. It simply continues. It changes shape over years and decades. It finds new rooms inside a person. It settles into corners that were built around someone who is no longer there, and it stays. That appears to be what Rusty Dennis lived with for the rest of her life after 1978. Rocky Dennis died at 17. He had lived with a condition that medicine had given very little hope for, and he had outlived those predictions through some combination of biology and will and the particular stubborn insistence of a person who had been told what he couldn't do and had simply not found that convincing enough to stop. He also lived in whatever complicated and imperfect form it took inside the love of a mother who never looked away from him. That love was not clean or simple. It did not look like the love described in parenting books or like the version the film offered its audience, which was emotional and true in its own way, but still shaped by what a story needs to be in order to be told to strangers in the dark. Rusty's love for Rocky was threaded through with her own unresolved grief and addiction and the wild, ungovernable way she had always moved through the world. It was love that sometimes failed. Love that sometimes cost Rocky something, but it was genuine, and Rocky, by every account, knew that. What Rusty said before she died matters because it refuses the easier version of the story. It would have been simpler in those final years to settle into the narrative of redemption, to say she had found peace, to offer a version of herself that sat comfortably on a screen or in a memoir. She didn't do that. She offered something harder and messier and far more honest, something that placed her fully inside the real complexity of what she had actually been, rather than the cleaner version of what she wished she had been. That takes a particular kind of courage, not the kind that announces itself, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't wait for applause because it knows none is coming. Rocky Dennis deserved a world that saw him fully. In many ways, he built that world himself, through force of personality and humor and a refusal to make himself smaller for anyone's comfort. But he also deserved, as every child does, a mother who could look at herself clearly, who could give an honest account of her presence and her absences without softening the edges to protect her own image. Rusty tried to do that. Imperfectly and late, and in the limited time she had left. Whether that is enough is not a question with an answer. It is the kind of question you carry rather than resolve. The kind that says something true and uncomfortable about grief and love, and what we actually owe to the people we lose, and whether we are ever really capable of paying it. Rocky lived. He was real, he was specific and irreplaceable, and far more than a symbol. And the woman who raised him, for all of her fractures and failures and the long, complicated years of her life after his, never stopped carrying him. That is what she said before she died. And it was devastating not because it was dramatic but because it was true. If this story stayed with you, it may be because something in it reaches past the surface. Rocky Dennis was not a symbol. He was a person. And the people who loved him were complicated and real in ways that a 2-hour film was never going to be able to hold completely. If you want to see more stories told this way, slowly, carefully, with the full weight they deserve, consider subscribing. And if something here moved you, leave a thought in the comments. These conversations matter. The people inside these stories deserve to be remembered by people who are willing to sit with the truth of them, even when the truth is hard.